Okay, hi everyone. Thanks for joining us this evening. I think we'll make a start now. Just so I'll start with the intro, my intro spiel about Zoom and what will happen with this seminar, and then we'll get going with the two papers we've got for today. Okay, so welcome everyone. This is the fifth seminar of the Contemporary Women's Writing and Medical Humanities online seminar series, organised with the support of the Centre for Contemporary Women's Writing at the IMLR in London. This online seminar series for postgraduates and early career researchers seeks to explore how contemporary women's writing in particular, be it fiction, poetry, autobiographical or philosophical writing, is currently engaging with issues such as illness, disease, healthcare, medical practice, and clinical institutions. There are a wide range of themes being covered, and we're always accepting ongoing abstracts, so please feel free to send over any ideas or expressions of interest. So we started in late September, and we're continuing until March 2021 with fortnightly seminars, always on Tuesday evenings at 5:30 UK time until roughly 7 p.m. You can register for the seminars via the IMLR, and we'll be putting the link in the chat later for the one in 2 weeks' time, the next one in 2 weeks' time. So now for some of the Zoom house rules. So this session is being recorded so it can be uploaded to the IMLR website. And on that note, you can go onto the IMLR website, and I'll link it in the chat later, and watch some of the past seminars if you're, interested. So please, during the seminar, please feel free to turn your cameras off or on, whichever you feel is most comfortable. We'll be having two roughly 15-minute papers, potentially a little bit longer because we've only got two for today, and then a Q&A session. If you could all remain on mute too during the papers until the Q&A session, this would be much appreciated. So during the Q&A, if you'd like to ask a question, please feel free to use the raise hand option on Zoom, and either Ben or I will come to you to unmute and ask your question yourself. You can find the raise hand icon by clicking on participants, then your own name, and then there's a little menu that pops up with some different options. You can also type question into the chat box followed by your question, or even just a comment during the papers themselves, or specifically during the Q&A section. And feel free to make those notes and the questions just as and when they come to you, or a bit later if you like. Okay, so I think that's my kind of spiel done. It's over to Ben now, who's going to be introducing the theme of this seminar and the two speakers.
Thanks very much, Becky. So this seminar is seminar 5, and we're going to be hearing two papers on the subject of female genital mutilation. So as we normally do, we'll have both of the papers, and then we'll move after that into the Q&A. So first up, we have Dr. Maria Tomlinson. Maria Tomlinson is a Leverhulme Early Career Fellow in the Department of Journalism at the University of Sheffield. The title of her project is Menstruation and the Media, Reducing Stigma and Tackling Period Poverty. She has published book chapters and articles in a variety of journals, including Feminist Media Studies and L'Esprit Créateur. Her PhD was funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council and was awarded by the University of Reading. Her research explored representations of menstruation, childbirth, and the menopause in women's writing from France, Algeria, and Mauritius. Her related monograph, From Menstruation to the Menopause, The Female Fertility Cycle in Contemporary Women's Writing in French, is forthcoming with Liverpool University Press in 2021. Maria has edited a special edition of L'Esprit Créateur and is currently editing a volume entitled Querying Bodily Norms in Francophone Culture, which is to be published by Peter Lang. So thanks very much, Maria. I'll pass the mic over to you now.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for attending my talk. I just realized that my topic has nothing to do with anything I've put in my bio. But to give some context, I actually wrote this paper when I was in between my last RA position, where I was working on a project about women's empowerment in West Africa, and my current project on menstruation in the media. So it's still linked in terms of kind of women's rights and gender, but it kind of reflects my transition from French studies and French literature specifically into media studies, so it's kind of in the middle there. So I'm just going to share my screen. Hopefully that will work. Okay, so in Niger, which is one of the poorest countries in the world, women have minimal rights, few educational opportunities, and are usually economically reliant upon men. Nigerian women's bodies are subject to patriarchal control and exploitation. This gendered power imbalance is evident in the very young age at which many women are married and thus leave school, as well as in the practice of female genital mutilation. For decades, local and international non-governmental organisations have been raising awareness of the physical and psychological harm FGM can cause. The arts have been fundamental to these efforts, such as through the performance of educational plays to rural communities, or the publication of novels that reach international audiences. Adele Barry, who you can see in the picture here, is a Nigerian author and laureate, and she's an example of a grassroots activist who has turned to creative practice in order to raise awareness about the harms that FGM can cause. She's a fantastic example of an author who marries their literary endeavours with their desire to make a difference in society. As a medical doctor, Barry has treated HIV patients. She's also the founder of Livre Niger, and has worked with a variety of NGOs, including those which focus on children or on HIV prevention. These experiences place her in an ideal position to write a novel about FGM and its link with HIV. She has also expressed in interviews that her purpose as a writer is to break the silence around taboo topics. So in this paper, I'm going to be looking at a short story of hers, which is called En attendant Minuit, and it's from a collection of short stories with the same title, so Waiting for Midnight. And this short story denounces the practice of FGM through the portrayal of a young girl called Kadi, and her childhood memories of FGM are triggered and as an adult when she's diagnosed with HIV. So if we situate Barry's text within a sub-Saharan African context, and frame it in relation to sociological studies about FGM, we can investigate the gendered power dynamics at play in this short story. So basically in my paper, I'm arguing that Barry's text opens up broader issues about how women themselves can be complicit in the perpetuation of patriarchal norms, and also in the disempowerment of subsequent generations of women. So first, I thought I'd give you a bit of context about the practice of FGM in Niger. In fact, compared to the neighbouring West African countries, the prevalence of FGM in Niger is actually quite low. It's estimated that around 4.2% of women living today in Niger have been cut. FGM is mostly practiced in rural areas and is actually much more common in the west of Niger. So that's close to the borders with Mali and Burkina Faso. And according to a statement made by Connie Pratt, who work at an NGO in Niger, 66% of women living in West Niger have been cut. The vast majority of these women have had both their clitoris and parts of their labia removed. So that's 78% of women in the West, and 6% have had their vaginas stitched together. So we can see there's kind of two types of FGM going on there. In Niger, in fact, most women undergo genital cutting before the age of 5, the case of the character in Adele Barry's story. It's usually carried out by traditional practitioners, and medicalised FGM, which is when a trained medical professional actually undertakes FGM, is quite rare in Niger. But actually all forms of FGM have been illegal there since 2003, but there's been very few prosecutions. And in fact, in order to avoid being prosecuted, some women are actually taken across the border to Mali, where FGM is actually still legal. So yeah, sadly, the law hasn't been enough to stop FGM, and therefore both local and international NGOs are trying to raise awareness about the physical and psychological harm FGM can cause. And Connie Pratt in Niger is working really hard to eradicate the practice. They run workshops with parents and with young women, and also with practitioners as well. And they try to encourage practitioners from stopping FGM by helping them to find alternative sources of income, such as farming. So you can see it's also an economic issue as well. So yeah, they do face-to-face talks and plays with the local population, and they also broadcast their messages in local languages on the radio, such as Hausa, for example. Okay, so now I am going on to talk about the book itself. So from the outset, it's evident that her short story is a narrative of trauma, detachment, and disempowerment that denounces a practice of FGM by shedding light on the lifelong detrimental impact it can have on women. Caddy only recovers her memory of a clitorectomy after being diagnosed with HIV. Her subsequent treatment by a gynecologist who informs her she's been cut, and her referral to a psychiatrist who helps her to rediscover her past. Barry encapsulates the power of artistic expression by bookending Attendant Minuit with Caddy's endeavours to come to terms with her past, to experience pleasure, and to find empowerment through her artwork. At the start of the story, Caddy attempts to paint an image of the seaside. She fails to complete the painting because the colour red triggers her anxiety. And she emphasises this anxiety in the short sentence that states that she just can't cope with the colour red. So this kind of foreshadows her flashback to a clitorectomy, and the fragmented text expresses this trauma. It's full of ellipses. It's cut into lots of different multiple sections. So structurally, you can see that her trauma is weaved into the text. And she also expresses a sense of detachment as well. She says that she likes to speak in the third person, and that's a way that she kind of shows reticence to acknowledge her past, and also shows how she's trying to escape her current emotional turmoil. So Barry sets the tone of the story by weaving a lexical field of trauma, loss, detachment, and shame throughout the first few sections of the text. Her sense of disempowerment is evident in the repetition of the word peur. So it says that she's scared multiple times in the first few pages. And she talks about crying, and she talks about kind of her feelings of stigma of being diagnosed with HIV. And when her fiance leaves her after she gets her diagnosis, Caddy highlights her innocence in the text by talking about the fact that she's a virgin. So she knows that she's not contracted HIV by having sex. I mean, this is important in the context of the text as well, because it talks about the importance of not having sex outside marriage in Nigerian culture. So she tries to show that, no, I've not acted against the moral codes of my society. I don't know why I have HIV. And she thinks, she's only 19 years old. And she's worried that she'll be seen as a prostitute in the eyes of her fiance. And of course, he does leave her. And here she's really tapping into what we could see as a transnational stereotype about people living with HIV, that they're viewed by others as promiscuous or dirty or immoral. So she's really kind of playing into those stigmatized attitudes that international readers as well will recognize. And she talks about how she feels like she resembles a mummy, just a naked sculpture, and she just feels the bones coming through her skin. So this kind of shows her weakness and her vulnerability. And although at this point the reader doesn't know about Caddy's clitorectomy, this kind of bleak image of her HIV status emphasizes the story's kind of anti-FGM stance, and showing how the impact of FGM can be lifelong psychology. So when Caddy actually does find out that she's been circumcised, she's really surprised. And her feelings of stigma are evoked when she compares her body, which she calls mutilated, to that of a normal woman. So here she's kind of putting herself as abnormal on the one side and putting other women who aren't cut as normal on the other side. And this kind of evokes her feelings of otherness. But actually, if we consider these feelings of otherness in the light of post-colonial criticism, we can actually argue that Caddy's attitude reflects an internalization of a neo-colonial discourse that otherizes the African woman. As Julia Jordan Zachary elucidates in her book, and I quote, "Early colonial European texts created a narrative of the Black woman as other and perpetuated a stereotype of Black women as ugly, different, and deviant," end quote. Today, this colonial gaze continues to inform a Western conceptualization of Black women who can experience an internalization of these scripts. Thus, we can argue that either Barry has inadvertently perpetuated a stereotype of the African woman as other, Or her text reveals the harm caused by neocolonial discourses that position the circumcised woman as other. The final symptom to which Barry's story refers is a lack of sexual desire and pleasure that circumcised women may experience. Some years after discovering that she is circumcised, Keddy meets a man called Hayden and marries him. The story details her inability to feel sexual pleasure. She illustrates that she will never be an empowered, desiring subject, but always a disempowered, desired object, unable to find joy through sexual intimacy. And this is evident on the level of language, as you can see on the PowerPoint, talking about how she feels, how pleasure for her is something fictional. And in the end, she decides to divorce Hayden, and she says it's because it's so that he could find happiness with another woman, and she says he'll find happiness with a real woman. So again, this shows her feelings of inadequacy and despondency. So again, we have once more this contrast between the body on the one side and the incomplete body on the other. So again, she's casting her own body in the position of the other. And of course, this potentially perpetuates a neocolonial perception of the African woman's body as other. And Keddy's sense of inferiority reflects broader socio-cultural issues about gender and power that have a transnational resonance. So Keddy's sexual disempowerment, which is as a result of her clitorectomy, is a powerful example of how patriarchal societies, and I quote, suppress women's sexuality, maintain their subjugation, and control their reproductive function, end quote. Indeed, as sociological texts show us, sexual control is one of the reasons why FGM is carried out. So anyway, after she discovers that she's had a clitorectomy, she wants to trace her footsteps and go back to her country so that she can fully recover her memory of the incident. And she goes back to her village, and the book refers to it as village in the third world. It uses that language specifically. And I think this reference to the third world, rather than providing a name for the specific place in Niger that she travels to, positions her story as 4 women in Africa who have been cut. And it kind of implies through the terms third world that poverty is the main reason why FGM is still practiced. Indeed, the description of her homeland emphasises poverty by referring to half-naked children running around a fire and commenting on the lack of infrastructure. So Keddy reveals that the exciseuse, so the woman that performs the excisions, her name is Adele, and she's paid very little. So by framing FGM in the context of poverty, Barry's story mirrors sociological studies because it suggests that poverty fuels the perpetuation of FGM. And if the economic rights of women are generally increased, then perhaps they could find alternative sources of income. So again, that resembles some of the activism I spoke about before, the idea that if you empower women economically, then they'll take part in other money-generating activities other than FGM. So as Keddy continues to walk around her village, she vividly remembers the details of her clitorectomy. These details include the death of the girl who, after being cut, bleeds to death. And she weaves together the terms blood and red consistently throughout this memory. And this invokes not only the horror of FGM, but also illustrates that Keddy associates this traumatic experience with the colour red, thereby revealing why she was anxious to use the colour red in her artwork on the very first page of the book. The dehumanisation of what Keddy refers to as the victims is inferred in the comparison between the room in which the ceremony is conducted and an abattoir. So the mixture of mud, rust, flies, and the girl's blood underscore the abject and unhygienic nature of the scene. By referring to the dirty implements used by Adele and the mixture of blood, the narrative indicates how easily HIV can be contracted during an FGM ritual. It is manifest in the lexical field of crime, horror, and violence that the passage offers a strong condemnation of the practice of FGM. The language used to characterise Yarel, her assistants, and the 5-year-old girls frames FGM as a criminal violation of human rights. And again, refers to the girls as being cut as victimes. And the women who are actually performing the ceremony, such as Adele, are referred to as criminals. According to Caddy, the exciseurs are not only criminals for the pain they inflict, but also for the future which they steal from the girls. And Caddy exclaims that they've taken away their future as women with sexual desire. So again, we see once more that this text constructs a binary opposition between the victims on one side, who are the little girls who are having clitorectomy, and the women performing the ceremonies on the other. But this, of course, is really problematic because it doesn't leave space for a more nuanced consideration of actually how the women performing the rituals may themselves be oppressed by the same cycle of patriarchy and violence. However, if you look into the text a little bit more deeply, you can actually see that the depiction of the female exorcist Yerel does actually problematize the binary conception of the gender power dynamics at play in the practice of FGM. It's clear that this character Yerel occupies a position of power in the village as the exciseurs to whom all the women take their daughters. Her characterization as an old witch and Caddy's assertion that Yerel smiles every time she takes off a clitoris paint Yerel as a powerful and cruel woman who is enthusiastically complicit in the patriarchal system, which valorizes her for her contribution to the oppression of women. Thus, the narrative illustrates the complex nature of the gendered power dynamics around FGM, because the women who perform the ritual wield a certain amount of power. So we can see that even though the text does set up some binary positions, it does think about how the women conducting the ceremonies doesn't beyond that think about how actually these women could be kind of internalized some patriarchal kind of perception of power themselves. And the text kind of again reasserts its very like anti-FGM stance through highlighting Yerel's brutality, and it really focuses on her smell and her dirty physical appearance, and it really constructs this image of the abject other who inspires horror in everyone who encounters. So the text is really trying to show the practice as violent through this character. However, if we kind of rethink this character through a post-colonial perspective, we can argue that this depiction of Yerel is also problematic because it resonates with colonial discourses about African women. The combination of brutal imagery, the supernatural connotations of her being a witch, paint her as a primitive figure. She is constructed as the savage, abject other who inflicts violence and exerts her power over others for her own pleasure. Her characterization echoes Western portrayals of FGM, which have a tendency to perpetuate stereotypes about African women as deviant and construct them as mutilators of their children. Although it is implied that Yerel may be acting out of financial necessity, we can argue that by creating a one-dimensional character about whose life we learn only that she is an exciseuse, Barry's text perpetuates neocolonial discourses about African women. So this otherizing is problematic because rather than convincing readers that FGM must be eradicated because of the harm it causes women, it may instead alienate West African readers who may otherwise have felt compelled by the narrative to advocate for the eradication of FGM. And of course, it may also reinforce Western readers' harmful neocolonial assumptions about African women. However, the text as well does look at ideas of empowerment, and Caddy does offer hope to other women who themselves have been circumcised. She herself says that she's too ill to take part in activism because of her HIV status, but she encourages other women and men to take part in not only eradicating eradicating FGM, but also raising awareness of how it can be linked to HIV. So for Caddy, it's actually art that empowers her more than anything else, because it's the only way she can express the inexpressible. And she says that she paints what she can't say to other people. And In contrast to the beginning of the story, at the very end, now that Caddy has recovered her memories, the hysterectomy, she's once again able to paint with red. So it shows kind of like her writing story and her processing it through art has been includes by problematizing a binary view of FGM that positions men as oppressors and women as victims. Barry's story makes an important contribution to 21st century conceptualizations of gendered power dynamics, both in the context of FGM, but also more broadly in terms of women's rights and freedoms. Barry's anti-FGM stance emerges strongly across the narrative. Through the character of Caddy, the story offers insights into a variety of psychological and physical consequences of FGM and illustrates the long-lasting detrimental impact they can have on women's lives. Although Barry's text can be criticised for the perpetuation of certain negative colonial stereotypes about the African woman, it does offer a more personal narrative on FGM that is absolutely absent from academic studies and a lot of activism. Barry has created a powerful condemnation of FGM, which, by focusing on the experience of an individual character, engenders sympathy in the reader and may also inspire them to take part in advocating against FGM. Yeah, thank you for listening. I will stop sharing my screen now.
Thanks so much for that, Maria. So I'm going to introduce the second speaker now. So Chiedozie Michael Uhuegbu is a PhD candidate in German Studies and Second Language Studies at Vanderbilt University. He earned his BA in French and German in 2010, followed by an MA in German Literature from the University of Nigeria, Nsukka, in 2015. He is a graduate fellow at the Center for Second Language Studies at Vanderbilt University. In the summer of 2018, he was awarded an Africa at a Crossroads grant for his dissertation research at the University of Hamburg, Germany. In the following year, he won the Gisela Mosig Summer Travel Award grant for dissertation research at the University of Freiburg. Michael's research interests include the genre of autobiography, the depiction of culture, and hybridity in African German migration literature. He recently earned a certificate in college teaching and humanities teaching from the Center for Teaching at Vanderbilt University. He is writing his dissertation, Borders, Belonging, and Otherness in African German Literature. Thanks very much. I'll pass the microphone over to you now.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction. As I was watching, Maria present her presentation, I was like, oh, what else do I have to present? It seems like she has already said everything that I can say or present. And yeah, so let me go ahead and share my screen. I have a tiny PowerPoint, and my PowerPoint is not as nice as her own. I already told her that. So the text that I have here is my abstract for those of us who didn't have the time to read my abstract. So the text is primarily written in German language, so I did a little bit of translation. So what you're going to see is my translation. So in case you find anything that doesn't seem so good, just know that it's a human being that did the translation. Good. So I'll go ahead and read my paper. Yeah. Noura Abdi and Linda's training in Zan seeks to break the cultural silence on female genital excision. Their text documents a painful cultural practice in Somalia, while also serving as an account of a personal experience growing up there. It narrates Noura's escape to Kenya and further move to Germany, where she was arrested at the Frankfurt airport with a fake passport. Recounting these experiences allows the authors to explain the aim of their book. It is much more important to fight this butchery, referring to female genital mutilation, which is carried out on young girls in Somalia and in other countries. Circumcision is barbaric. People are mutilated with full consciousness, and this should be stopped once and for all. Of course, I never dreamt of writing a book about this, but I always hoped that one day I would be able to help the women who are affected. Noura's engagement with writing conceptualizes the knowledge gained through transcultural migration. This migration produced a wealth of new encounters and shed light on evidence previously ignored while living in Somalia and Kenya. Her story touches upon the female body from a migrant and self-narrating perspective. What happens when the place of experience is characterized by a constant shift between two homes, two cultures, and two countries? What does this constant crossing between two cultures how does this constant crossing between two cultures affect the autobiographer's identity and self-expression? Noura Abdi was circumcised at the age of 4 by her mother. She grew up in Mogadishu, but because of civil war riots, her family fled to Kenya, where Noura and her parents lived as refugees. Noura plans her flight to the United States with the intention of a stopover in Germany, but the fake passport of the cousin she is traveling with is discovered in Frankfurt, a development which abruptly thwarts her plan. Unable to continue to the United States, she remains in Germany. Her migration and further encounter with the German culture and German women enables Noura to experience Western culture. Reflecting on her experience growing up in Somalia, she breaks away from her cultural roots, delineating the sufferings caused by female genital mutilation. The text, written collaboratively with German author Leolinda, calls for an end to such barbaric acts and culture they inflict on Somali and other women worldwide. This paper considers the ways in which Noura takes up the story of her body and migration to Germany through narrative practice. I explore how Abdi and Linda's text stands as a medium of resistance against female genital mutilation, FGM. Immersed in the visualities of memories, the authors recreate the subject of FGM and migration as an I who observes life. Migration empowers her stand against FGM by revealing the oppression, violence, and deprivation of her sexual identity through her encounters with the Germans. Noura's identification shifts in the process of narrating her past. By focusing on the character's transcultural formation, I analyzed the meanings Noura gives to taste, culture, and religion as a crucial component in representing the problematics of cross-cultural encounter. According to Muhammad and Anthony in a report for the World Bank and the United Nations Population Fund, FGM denotes the traditional practice in which part of or the entire external female genitalia is removed. The authors refer to a definition of sumna, the Arabic word for circumcision, in the glossary. Sumna is religiously connected and is a circumcision in which either the clitoral foreskin or the clitoris itself is removed. Abdi and Linda's definition captures the religious connotation to FGM practice and religious repression of the Somali womanhood. FGM stands out as a cultural and religious practice of the Somalis. Noura's story foregrounds the connection in that culture being caught and coming of age as a woman. A day before the circumcision, Noura's mothers and others of the soon-to-be circumcised girls encourage the girls, giving them reasons why they need to be mutilated. They said, you should not disgrace your family tomorrow. We shall find out tomorrow which of you is the bravest, because a self-pity girl becomes shame on their whole family. Noura's view regarding FGM before migration to Germany embodies the idea of purity in relation to womanhood and religion. She says, for us, circumcision is a prerequisite for being accepted into the community of decent women. We can only get in through circumcision. Only whores are uncircumcised. If you want to be respected, you have to be pure. Purity is a constant requirement of our culture, a basic need of every Somali. Although Noura recounts her story as an adult who has lived in Germany for some years, nevertheless, the text depicts a Noura submerged in the Somali culture. The cultural initiation inducts the girls into the society of womanhood. The induction symbolizes the purity of the female body which is with his scared responsibility of purity to the future husband and children upon birth. So I continue again to cross-cultural transition. Noura's migration necessarily leads to intercultural and cross-cultural encounters. Her experience with the German culture forms the core of her autobiographical narration as she becomes exposed to a new world. Noura comes to Germany at the age of 18 as a circumcised young woman. She holds all that she has to do with circumcision in high esteem until her contact with the Germans and other migrants suggested otherwise. Her encounter with a new culture reveals differences in relation to the female body and circumcision. These differences are, as gender roles in general, culturally created and defined by Judith Butler. In Gender Trouble, Feminism and Subversion of Identity, Judith Butler investigates the categories of genders and sex, as well as feminine and masculine identities. Butler distinguishes between gender and sex, stressing that it is not sex that determines gender, but rather that gender impacts the production of sexes through cultural construction. She explains that gender is also the discursive cultural means by which sex nature or a natural sex is produced. In Butler's theorization, gender is not fixed but proves to be performative, that is, constituting the identity that is purported to be. Gender is always a doing, she claims. Difference appears in the praise Noura gives to FGM. In Somalia, circumcision is only spoken of in nice words. Now I am surrounded by people who react over the same issue with horror. I came to the same conclusion as everyone else. Something was wrong with me. I got scared of myself, she exclaims. Noura's submersion in a new cultural environment makes her reevaluate herself and her culture. Her presence in Germany and interaction with other migrants highlights her difference. Although post-colonial Germany acts as a space for Noura's coming to terms with her cultural identity as a circumcised woman, her identification as a circumcised Somali opens up new cultural horizons that shape her identity. Noura's circumcision story brings the Germans and the other migrants in contact with her identity. Noura remembers that the reaction was amazing every time. They attacked me and called me a liar. Nobody wanted to believe that there was anything like female circumcision. She brings her listeners into an encounter with the Somali culture, revealing its distinctiveness. Deconstructing strangeness, Hoffman argues that strangeness comes up as an object of experience. Significantly, FGM immerses both parties in a state of strangeness since it destabilizes the experience of femininity and genital mutilation. The cultural contact exposes Noura as being different from the fellow migrants. Hannah, a popular musician from Ethiopia, fled her country as war broke out. She becomes friends with Noura and welcomes her to the refugee home in Düsseldorf. Again, Noura's contact with the outside world reveals that she is perceived as a victim of FGM and not its proud representative. Hannah made it clear to Noura and other Somali victims, "You are smooth as a wall down there. They have taken away your feelings. They ruined your body." The text embeds Hannah's voice in the narration to present a different perception of her body. Although Noura pushes back, claiming that she is a normal human being, like any woman with feelings, her circumcision, purity, and glory is already debased through cross-cultural contact. It becomes clear to her that she was broken and ruined and never dignified into womanhood as she thought before moving to Germany. Clothing provides additional information about Somalia and its cultural norms. The dira, a long dress of transparent fabric that must be worn by women even in a swimming pool or on a beach, reflects Somali beliefs and values. Noura states, in Somalia, it is completely unthinkable for a woman to show her body and not being stoned. Hadira, this symbolizes what Hall calls lived practices in his definition of culture. Swimming with dira instead of a swimsuit underlines the religious value of modesty and purity that are connected to gender expectation. Notwithstanding, living outside her community presents puzzles for Nura as she encounters the summer season in Germany. Her memories of how she and her friend used to swim with wet diras in Somalia creates an abrupt flash forward and comparison about her first bikini in Germany, and how ashamed she felt wearing it. In her words, there were naked female bodies everywhere. Terrible. I was really shocked, but it was at the height of the summer. Her perception of nudity is based on the exposure of body parts she is used to keeping concealed. She cannot enter an outdoor swimming pool with the dura. Migration leaves her no choice than to assimilate to the bikini culture. She said, so then I bought a bikini the first time in my life. The bikini event directs the narrative from the present location of Germany to Somalia, where Nura appears to compare the everyday life of swimming in public. In his discussion of assimilation of a form of cultural encounter, Delaunty argues that a dominant culture assimilates the weaker culture it encounters. Nura's experience as a cultural shift as she buys a leopard skin. Nura experiences a cultural shift as she buys a leopard skin bikini, something that looks African. In her dire need to cover her body, she wrapped up her towel around her body so that no skin was to be seen. Assimilation erodes the cultural practices she came with to Germany. Further contact with her colleagues and superiors at work revealed more about her identity. While waiting for her asylum application to go through, she starts working for a cleaning firm at the Düsseldorf airport for 18 hours a day, where she cleans the interior of airplanes. The airport becomes a space of cultural encounter between cleaners, the stewardess, and the pilot. Nura focuses on class structure. She remains conscious of her persona as a refugee and a cleaner. When a Lufthansa pilot touched her, he was not even ashamed to help us with cleaning. He was referring to the pilot. In her view, the Lufthansa pilot treats her as a human being. She loves the idea that the people here don't have that horrible arrogance. The workspace becomes another cross-cultural encounter for Nura. She contrasts the German working atmosphere with the African. That would have been unthinkable for an African airline. Every steward command you around. Here, throw that away. Get that out. The pilot's gestures and the African supposed insensitivity convey cultural norms. Again, Nura appears xenocentric in her comparison, describing the German workspace atmosphere as more respectful and cordial, and seeming to lack class structure. Nura's source of identity is her Somali culture. Germany constitutes the battleground for her lived experiences as it juxtaposed with her migrant experience. This juxtaposition produces a transcultural identity, a transmutation between and at the same time simultaneous presence of former and current home, of past and lived social encounter. Being open about her circumcised identity brings her in contact with a London surgeon who helps her to get through the surgery in Saarbrücken. At first, the surgery is a matter of concern as she prefers to be identified as a Somali. Somali convention dictates that she has to remain circumcised before marriage and a virgin since she must not have done it with other men. The first few days of marriage as a Somali woman represents the first space for sexual discovery and pain. In her quest to transform, she accepts the advice of her friend. Forget Somalia. Transculturation, Wolfgang Welch explained, is a consequence of the complexity of the modern culture, which interpenetrate or emerge from one another. Welch's thesis focuses on the idea of motion, the movement of migrants from one place to another, gaining new knowledge, broadening their horizon, and adopting new identity. He further argues that the acceptance of their transcultural constitution is a condition of becoming resigned to societal transculturality. From Welch's standpoint, Noura's acceptance of surgically repairing her mutilated genitals is evidence of coming to terms with their migratory process and circumcised identity. A short holiday in Nairobi reveals the transformation that Noura has undergone while in Germany. She refers to her transculturation as transition. Noura remembers that she screams loudly as her father tries to slaughter a goat, thus showing sympathy. Her outburst of emotion brings her family to laughter. In bringing a sense of immediacy of experience to her emotions, her narration gives voice to her family members. Okay, here is it. What is CC you have become? Do people become so weak after living in Europe for some time? Then you better come back. That's her family member was telling her. The family's observation confirms the evidence of another personality. Previously, Noura could grab goats, would not let go of their legs, skin the animal, and even remove the intestine by herself. Noura's transition shows the transcendence of supposedly monocultural standpoint, which she underwent while in Germany. Noura further recounts, I was also the one who was amazed at the bus stops in Nairobi, how the old women, who like everyone else struggled through the crowds of people who with elbows and kicks to get in. No word of excuse if they hit someone in the ribs, not even a regretful look. Just keep boxing, rummaging, pushing forward. And what should I say? This also made me angry. Migration has changed her expectation for sympathy and politeness. She recalls the above scene as an eyewitness and remembers this setup as an orderly space. At least I thought with satisfaction of the queue that people formed in front of the cash registers in a German supermarket, where they say sorry if anyone accidentally nudges you. Her memory suggests the partial deculturalization of her past and the added creation of a new cultural identity. My conclusion. Noura's, Abdi, and Leolinda's training in Zan recounts a historical event, the challenging of the unexpected formation of a Somali-German identity. The text takes a new stand against female genital mutilation, while creating a space for cross-cultural encounter. The text shed light on a cultural practice that is seen as a gruesome and despicable in the Western world, while at the same time, the supposed glory behind being a circumcised adult female in Somalia is exposed. As Noura crosses international borders, the text shows the many different experiences that feed transcultural identity. With her unexpected arrest at Frankfurt and forceful asylum in Germany, the country brings to light the transition not only of physical borders between countries, but of cultural spaces ranging from Somalia to Kenya and the United States and finally Germany. This transition leaves its traces in the transgressing individual. Germany, a place of forced rest and safety, brings to light the invisible in Noura. Her journey to Europe shapes her and her sister's identity, making both their past and contact with Europe a vital role in the collaborative autobiographical narration. Migration paves the way for the erosion of Noura's cultural understanding and identification. It changes her understanding of her femininity, which in turn defines her identity. Thank you so much. I'll go ahead and stop sharing my screen.
Thanks so much for that, Chiedozie. And remember to everyone that if you have any comments or questions about either of the discussions, you can put them in the chat, and then Becky and I will come back to them now in the Q&A. So to start off, I just had a question for both of you, actually. So Maria, you were talking in your presentation about art as being empowering in the area on FGM, and particularly in the text that you were talking about. I was wondering whether you could talk a little bit more about that, and to both of you, kind of how have you found more broadly that this is represented in medical humanities research on FGM more broadly, and what role does this relationship between art and empowerment play in kind of more broader conversations in the medical humanities on FGM?
Should I go on first?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so in my research, I found out that there have been a lot of research, especially from the Western world, how doctors are trying to, in collaboration with the United Nations, trying to stop, the practice of FGM. And it's been something that United Nations is fighting. That's why you could see that I cited someone who worked with the United Nations, trying to find the history and how it is being done in most countries, especially in Somalia, which I actually looked at. But it's something that these texts, like I try to show, is trying to empower women and empower the society to see that it is not. They have sold lies to you to make you believe that once you become circumcised, you become a woman. But in reality, you have been ruined. You have been been destroyed as a woman. Your glory has been taken from you. It's contrary to what they make you believe.
Thanks very much.
Thanks for your question, Ben. That's a really, really, really great question. I think art has been really central in kind of activist efforts to challenge the practice of FGM. So, I mean, that's not just kind of through literature, but also through kind of like works of art, also through kind of like the radio as well. Because in Niger, a lot of women don't have access to the internet and they get a lot of their information through the radio. So actually plays on the radio can be quite a good way of kind of engaging women in conversations around FGM. And also kind of there's actually quite a tradition of in countries in Africa that practice FGM of activism that involves plays. So I've read quite a bit of work about how kind of plays have actually been in a way more central to empowerment than actual written texts. But as well, I thought your point was really interesting and relevant to kind of broader medical humanities as well. So in my research on menstruation, for example, actual works of art are really good in kind of breaking the stigma around periods. So if you think about kind of artistic representations of menstrual blood, that kind of makes you face the stigma right in its face. I actually don't know about artworks of FGM at all. So if anyone knows about art, kind of that kind of art and how it's kind of raising awareness and that kind of thing, I'd love to hear about it.
Thanks very much, Maria. So we've got a few questions on the chat as well. So Victoria says, thank you very much for the talks. Fascinating. I was interested in hearing more about the autobiography genre, specifically the connection between autobiography as a genre and medical humanities as a field. Thank you. So I guess that question's to both of you as well. I don't know who wants to go first.
I'm muted again. Yeah, it's a very interesting question. I have not actually, tried to draw a connection between medical humanities and autobiography. But in my research, regarding autobiography, which we might want to look into different forms in way people try to, self-narrate their experience in life. Like one of the things that I ended up doing with this text is to explain that it's not actually autobiography, because there is a collaborative, there's a ghostwriter in there. I ended up saying it's a collaborative auto fiction because of the presence of the ghostwriter who and the person who is narrating her experience, who does not actually speak German, because I had correspondence with the ghostwriter, the German guy. But in terms of medical humanities, it's actually a way. If you read most genre of autobiography, people use it to tell their experience about things that have happened to them, medically, or, like this issue of FGM, or something they have experienced in life. So autobiography in all its form. There is also another form of autobiography, which some authors argue that it's not autobiography. It bears similarity, testimonial narratives. It's a way people voice it's a genre is for those who are in the minority voices. They want to say how the oppressed they are, or what is going on within their body, or it could also be a way people take up the stories of their body, put it into text so that people can get to know what is happening. I don't know if I answered the question.
Thanks very much. Maria, do you want to answer as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, another great question. So Adele Barry's text isn't autobiographical. I couldn't find anywhere on the internet whether she herself has actually undergone FGM, but I think it's extremely unlikely based on kind of her background and also kind of where in Niger that she's from. But it is kind of like, from what she said in interviews, it's kind of a patchwork of different testimonies from women with whom she's worked. So even though she may not be able to talk from her own kind of autobiographical perspective, it is very much based on her interactions with women. And it's with women as well in the context of her doctor's surgery, which kind of makes sense why sometimes the book is a little bit clinical. But I think what the book is really good at doing as well is kind of capturing the kind of personal, emotional side of it. So perhaps that comes from kind of some testimonies from women she's worked with. And she's not a psychiatrist, but I would imagine if women are discussing gynecological issues with her, it would come up. So I think what she does there, which I haven't seen in any other texts about FGM, and again, this is why art is so important. She imagines how a woman actually experiences FGM, rather than kind of creating some kind of broad discourses about what FGM is and how it should be stopped.
Thanks very much. I guess on the subject of autobiography and this question from Victoria to both of you two, I was just wondering how does autobiography function within healthcare on FGM and kind of a patient's own narrative within the clinical setting? Have you come across much work on this? I guess actually in the clinical encounter, if someone is being, if someone is talking to a doctor about FGM.
No, I haven't actually. I'd love to read something like that. That would be really useful. But no, like it's a lot of texts are just very medical, just talking about body parts and not really treating people as people. And kind of the psychological aspects appear to be missing. I seem to have to look through kind of literature and fiction to find that side of it more. But it is kind of mentioned in other texts, but again, it's very kind of broad and you kind of lose the personal sense of trauma, because obviously everyone's experience of FGM is different, because not only you've got all the different types of FGM, you've also got FGM, of course, that's medical FGM that's practiced today, which is done in a kind of safer environment by trained people. So that's a different experience from someone who has had FGM done kind of in another rural setting or something like that. So there's some more research on that would be really useful.
Thanks very much. I don't know whether Chiedozie wanted to respond to that on autobiography within the clinical setting, and whether you'd read any work on that.
Yeah, I have, but there is a work by Sidney Smith where about women's writing. In one of the works in India, she wrote about how people tell about the stories of cancer through autobiographical practice. So apart from this work that I focus on, there is also a French scholar, I've forgotten the title of the book, who writes about, from a standpoint of testimonial narrative, or people undergoing, female genital mutilation from Congo, but apart from that, I've not actually seen any work where people tell doctors, about their experiences and kind of publish it.
Thanks very much. We've got a few other questions in the chat. We've got Mary, who says, what has been the critical reception of these books in their home countries and in Europe?
Adele's book has been really well received in Niger, like it's won prizes. But I've tried to find information about kind of its broader reception in terms of kind of like the everyday population and what they think of it. But I can only find information about kind of the prizes the book has won. So I know kind of literarily it's been really well praised, but I don't know what kind of normal citizens in Niger think about it. But of course, not everyone in Niger speaks French, and her book's written in French. So that's kind of one barrier. And I think that there's so many like local languages in Niger. Most Hausa is quite popular, and a lot of the local radio stations kind of broadcast in Hausa and other local languages. So there's kind of really an issue around kind of like colonialism and education there. So I don't think, as far as I can tell, her book hasn't been translated into any local languages. So yeah, it'd be interesting to see actually if it was translated into Hausa, what the reception would be. Because I guess at the moment it's all kind of the literary elites that are reading her book and enjoying it. So yeah, I mean, is it, if as she says, she wants to kind of raise awareness, the question is, who is she raising awareness to? Like, who is her audience, and kind of whose ideas is she trying to change? Because if she's writing a book in order to try and change the minds of people who perform the practices because of their social economic status, it's actually unlikely they know French. But she does kind of do everyday kind of like activist work herself. So I would assume that she's written the book largely with a kind of international audience in mind, I would have thought. But again, I can't find information on this.
It's almost the same thing with mine, because when I actually started doing research about, this text, it was written in German and there's no English translation. And you could even scarcely find information about the text even anywhere on the internet. So it seems to me that there is no knowledge about the text in Kenya or even in Somalia, but I place it under these minority voices in Germany, German text, but in the minority voices. But I feel that the point where these authors try to like tackle this FGM is from a point where from the Western world, that if the Western world can get to see and read the story, they could, go to the United Nations and study from there, because these are the people who can penetrate most of these countries in Africa where people don't have access to the internet or to Western education to understand how bad these practices are.
Thank you. We've got a comment from Priyanka as well, who says, Maria, I was just wondering of how does your presentation alter its discourse if you see it through the element of decoloniality?
I love this question. Thank you so much, Priyanka. It's a wonderful question. So I've been thinking about the answer, and it's a really tough question. I think that, of course, when I started writing this paper, because I actually originally wrote it for a conference a year ago, and I'm now trying to publish it it should be published as a chapter in an edited volume next year or the year after. I was thinking, okay, I really wanted to see this text by Adele Barry as a very kind of like decolonial text that would kind of reimagine or well, not really reimagine, but would give us a very authentic representation of FGM. And I thought, well, actually, in a sense, it can't be that authentic because it's in French. So that's a problem. But I suppose it's kind of, if you looked at it through a decolonial perspective, I guess it's an attempt to kind of reappropriate narratives of FGM that are very much kind of influenced by kind of Western thinking. Because of course, when Niger was colonized, when countries that practice FGM were colonized by France, the French very much saw FGM as a kind of barbaric practice, and it was kind of in their kind of policies of cultural assimilation, it was something they tried to eradicate. So if Adele Barry's novel was more about kind of like how FGM was an aspect of Nigerian culture and kind of very much drew on the specific cultural context of Niger, I think it would be a better example of kind of like decolonizing the FGM narrative. But the way in which she writes it is very universalist and very broad, and she doesn't give that many specific details about Niger, which I think is actually really problematic. So I think that the issue is she's probably trying to reach a broad kind of francophone international audience and isn't really kind of decolonizing or problematizing Western assumptions about FGM as she could. So yeah, I hope that makes sense. Because yes, I did want to do a decolonial reading of the story, and I was quite disappointed that I couldn't really do it as much as I wanted to.
I should say as well that if anyone wants, I know that we're reading out the questions that people are writing, but if anyone wants to turn on their microphone and respond to anything that's been said in the discussion, please feel free to do so at any time. Thanks very much, Maria. There was also a comment from Sumya, who says, won't it be right to call it autopathography rather than autobiography? So yeah, I guess, again, that's a question to both of you. Would you refer to these texts as autopathography?
Yeah. I came across that when I was actually doing that research, and one of the big writers, I just looked it up again, is Thomas Kusa. He wrote much about autopathography. One of why I didn't end up adopting that term, because it's more to do about sickness, writing about sickness. That the word pathography, the author we know is self, and in pathography it's actually with writing about sickness or disabilities, not actually kind of a cutting or dismemberment of a particular part of the body. That the word pathography would have fit for me in the sense I was looking at FGM, but I feel something is missing. It's not actually we might want to argue that it's a disability, that being circumcised is a disability, but it's not actually a sickness per se. It's just my argument.
Thanks very much. So if everyone keeps writing any questions that they have in the chat, or put your hand up. In the meantime, I have another question for Chiedozie. I thought it was really fascinating the way you referenced Butler in your presentation, and we're looking at kind of gender theory, etc., and bringing that into dialogue with this discourse of FGM. And I had a question for you and for both of you actually about, what role do you think that kind of gender theory has to, and gender and queer theory has to play in these discourses of FGM? Obviously, Butler's texts are very, have been, well, at least her earlier texts were very linguistic about how the body is kind of constructed in discourse and language and stuff like that. And you've kind of you've talked about Butler's work in relation with something that's very physical and bodily. So yeah, what do you think? What role do you think broadly gender theory, queer theories, not just Butler, but gender theory, queer theory more broadly, has to play in FGM discourses? Yeah, I'm sorry, I guess that's my question.
Yeah, I would want to say that it's a very interesting question, and it's very tricky for me because I'm not a gender theory person, and Butler it's someone that I find so hard to understand. It's just me, I know, but I will, for me, I looked at it from a perspective of the idea of being caught as a woman, and it's the idea of performing, the identity that it's been performing. So that is actually how, like, okay, there is no way I could just describe this, make this argument without actually going back to Butler, see what Butler said, try to tie it in and give you what I could summarize from Butler. I don't know if I answered the question, and I try to in case I don't answer it perfectly, just take it that I'm not an expert in gender theories.
Thanks very much for that. What about you, Maria? Were you what role does gender theory and queer theory, I guess, broadly play within your own project?
In terms of the FGM paper, or in terms of my own kind of broader research on menstruation?
I guess both, actually. Maybe FGM first, and whether, I don't know whether there's any explicit writing in Butler and elsewhere on FGM in gender and queer theory, or what role that plays within your project anyway, and then also in your work on menstruation. Yeah,
that's a great question. So yeah, I mean, gender is so central to FGM. There's such a long, I'm trying to think of a short answer because I have a very long one. I mean, the whole of my paper is about kind of gender imbalances, because you've got kind of, it's not just, because a lot of Western texts I read about FGM are very much FGM, patriarchal, men in charge, men's ideas, that FGM is a thing and women are victims. But it's actually, as Barry's novel shows, way more complex than that, because yes, okay, that you can argue that yes, these women that perform the FGM are kind of part of the same kind of patriarchal system, and kind of maybe they've internalized these values. But I think that would be really reductionist to argue, and that's why I kind of wanted to make the kind of economic point that, you know, if it's your only source of income, it's very difficult to kind of find something else to do. And yeah, it's very much kind of enmeshed with like, if we take I think the best approach we can take to FGM, as with a lot of feminist issues, is an intersectional one. So obviously someone's experience of FGM is going to be inflected by kind of their socioeconomic status, also kind of like their religion, also kind of the specific culture in which they live. So I'm sure an FGM narratives from each kind of different geographical area will be very different, kind of depending on that. So I think it's really important that we take an intersectional approach, because if we don't, we can kind of just end up reappropriating this colonial paradigm of kind of like patriarchy on one side and like female victims on the other. So I think that's where economy comes in, through the kind of intersectional approach I was trying to take. Whereas in my current project about menstruation in the media, gender and queer theory play an absolutely enormous role in my work. So, you know, for example, I use a lot of theory from critical menstruation studies, and the discipline recently has thankfully now focused more, or made sure that transgender and non-binary menstruators as well are included. So thinking about how actually, you know, it's not just women who have periods. People who menstruate, you know, can be transgender men or non-binary people. So it's important about thinking how the aspect of gender kind of influences their own experiences of menstruation, and as well the importance for activists to make sure they're inclusive. But you've got that kind of problematic area that a lot of the stigma around menstruation is very much gendered and very much relates again back to patriarchal ideas about women. So it's kind of getting that balance between gender inequality and kind of women's rights and feminism, but also making sure you include transgender and non-binary menstruators as well in the conversation. So kind of like queer theory and feminist theory is kind of really central to my project in terms of thinking about discourses about menstruation and how people can internalize those discourses and how it can kind of affect their kind of like self-worth and that kind of thing.
Thanks very much. Have you found many discourses of trans discourses of FGM or queer discourses of FGM as well?
I've not specifically looked for them, but I would really be interested to find them, and it would be really good to see if they're out there. I mean, the menstruation movement has literally only in the past kind of 2 to 3 years started to think on a more kind of like gender inclusive level. And, you know, with FGM and menstruation, the kind of commonality between the two in a way is the fact they're both kind of taboo subjects. There's both a lot of stigmas around them. So I think maybe in the future we will see that kind of text about FGM as well. But I don't think there's been the same kind of, with menstruation, there's been a lot of effort over the past few years, particularly the past 5 years, of activists and the media to destigmatize and normalize menstruation. Whereas with FGM, it doesn't seem to appear in the media as much, or at least I've not noticed it.
Thanks very much. I wondered that same question to Chiedozie, whether you'd ever come across, whether you've come across many LGBT or queer trans experiences of FGM?
No.
Okay, thanks very much. I can see on the chat that Becky has a few questions, so I'll pass over to Becky.
Hi, thanks, Ben. Yeah, I had a few questions, so there'll be like a couple for both of you, potentially. So for Chiedozie, I was really interested about the role of Linda, and I was wondering whether you knew much about how that kind of relationship came about and what it's a he, right? How his role came about in terms of transcribing or like being involved in the writing process, because I was just and it was interesting that you characterized it as autofiction as well. So I was wondering about like whether you knew much about like the role, what was sort of fictionalized or what was dramatized and what sort of autobiographical. And then my second question for Maria, I thought it was really fascinating. You're talking about like the socioeconomic, well, the economic reasons for women in Niger in the book, kind of, and in the activism as well. I think you mentioned the economic reasons for doing so, and I was wondering to what extent there are any reasons or rationale explored that kind of maybe link with what Chiedozie was saying in terms of like cultural reasons, like in terms of like the purity narrative in a way, and like whether there are other kind of motivations that are more powerful than the economic, or like what's the balance in terms of the reasons coming together for doing this practice. And then also for Maria, I was wondering to what extent HIV is explored. I was wondering whether is it like kind of like a diving board moment, I suppose, at the beginning of the narrative, or is it explored more fully? And I was just interested, that leads me kind of what I was going to ask Chiedozie for a second question, whether it's like into this idea of like pathology interwoven with the kind of realization, or she's told that she's had FGM, and I was wondering, in terms of like autopathography, whether that start point in a medical encounter, this realization, whether that kind of roots it more in the kind of autopathography. And I was wondering with both of you, like, because a lot of at least what I've kind of like read, mainly in like newspaper articles or essays and what have you on FGM, there's a lot of discussion about the ramifications and kind of like the negative and sexual health and sexual pleasure kind of like ramifications after having FGM. And I was wondering whether your two narratives touch on those kind of aspects at all, or whether it's more about kind of like cultural significance and the moment of having FGM, because I suppose that would root the text more as like autopathographies if there are kind of physical kind of like pain or etc., like things that happened afterwards to the body. And then finally, we're getting there, I thought it was really interesting that like the for both of you in both of your texts, the realization, or like the sort of like starting the realization in your text, Maria, but also like the start point of reflection in yours, Chiedozie, for both of the women seems to be like at a point of kind of rupture or some sort of interruption, like the HIV diagnosis, the medical encounter for you, Maria, and then Chiedozie like moving abroad and experiencing a different culture. And I was wondering whether there's like there seems to be like a theme of repression. So there's this, and like linking to kind of like the psychological kind of aspect of it, whether there's like repression and there needs to be kind of a sort of a rupture in some way or form in order for the narrative about FGM to come out. That makes sense. Yeah, I'm done now.
Should I go first? Okay, so when I discovered the name, the Linda in the text, so I Googled him up and I noticed that he's a very known, he writes in Germany. So, but looking at his biography, he hasn't lived in Germany. He hasn't lived in anywhere in Africa. So I found his email online, emailed him. So he told me that Nura told him all the story. He just transcribed it. He told him the story in English. He transcribed it. So there is a translation of English, into German for it to be published into the German word. So at that point, we will say, oh, there is an immediacy, going on, and there is a loss of authenticity in the text. because at some point he might have added is when there's no is, but he said he told me that he had to like sit down to review some of the text to make sure that it was kind of her story that is written in German. But in the cover page of the book, about the author page, the name comes up, but on the front page, the name, they only say Nura Abdi. But about the author, you see Yolinda. So the question for me is that why would there be two authors of a book about the author but different from the cover page? So what I did in my analysis, in my broader analysis, I looked at Gerard Jenner as an analysis of paratext. That's actually how to come up that the idea of ghostwriting. The ghostwriting tries to there is an addition of voice with the inclusion of when you ghostwrite from someone. So that is actually why I say, okay, there is an element of fiction somewhere which you can't actually point out immediately, but with the inclusion of with the idea of ghostwriting and looking at that, ghostwriting is actually part of the genre of autobiography, a subsection too. But authors suggest that there is an element of there's an auto-fictional part of ghostwriting that brings into autobiography. I mentioned this word, sometimes it confuses me in my brain. Yeah. So in looking at the whole, your second question about the repression psychology, for me, and from reading the text, there was no repression or rupture, that actually went, between it. What actually happened was the cross-cultural encounter, the migration, moving from from a place where FGM is glorified and you are, and it's seen as something that should be held in high esteem, to a place where people don't understand what you're talking about. That's actually, I brought a quote where someone telling you are being ruined, you are smooth as a wall down there. It's migration brought her to a point where she now sees something that is glorified from a point of view of other women who now say, no, you are not glorified, you are disdained. So migration, if I want to borrow your word, is actually the repression, the psychological reflection that took place, without the presence of a memory, reflection, I don't know if I was able to clarify a little bit. Yeah, I missed one of your questions. Could you repeat the second question that you posed so that I don't?
Yeah, it was about the question of are any of the kind of the potential health ramifications, negative health ramifications post excision, are they present in the text as well?
Yeah. Thank you so much. Yeah, in the second chapter, so after the circumcision, she was bleeding, profusely, but was taken to a doctor where they gave her pain medication. So apart from that, there was no mention of post circumcision, what actually happened, how she felt. No one. It wasn't actually brought up until she came to Germany. And another place where she could talk about was, when she contacted a doctor whom, helped her to get, the vagina and the clitoris surgically repaired. She wasn't writing about it in a way of talking about her pains. In what it was, the pains was described, in the way the woman, stretched her legs. This one grabbed the leg here, they don't grab the legs, as if they were just handling, some kind of plastic or so. And the cutting was done and the jubilation. Oh, we got it done, we got it done. So it wasn't. She wrote that part for me as a way of trying to describe bodies in pain, trying to describe pain, the pain that she underwent while she was under the razor. It wasn't trying to describe an extensive description of pain, in yeah, that is actually what happened.
Yeah, actually, there's some quite interesting parallels between kind of the two texts, mine and Chiedozie's text, and the fact that there is this kind of moment of rupture as well, as you said, Becky. But also, actually, yeah, I don't think I mentioned that the character Caddy is actually living in France. Don't know. Again, the text doesn't say. So she's somewhere that's not in Africa, somewhere European, but again, we're not told where, when she gets the diagnosis, because obviously she has to fly back to Niger from wherever she is, which is likely France, but we don't know. And the doctor is surprised to discover, because obviously when she's first diagnosed with HIV and they say, well, you know, who have you slept with, blah, 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 she feels very kind of intimidated and very scared and really ashamed about it. And when she says that, you know, she's a virgin, they're kind of confused by it and they don't really believe her. And then she goes to a gynecologist for an internal exam later on, and the gynecologist says, oh yes, you know, I see that you're circumcised. And she says, what? You know, she has no memory of it whatsoever. And that is what kind of triggers her journey into her past, but she doesn't fully remember what happened to her until she actually goes back to her native village. And yes, so your previous answer about kind of other reasons for FGM, I mean, there are so many, and again, they depend on kind of geography, they depend on kind of the ethnicity of the people performing FGM. But in some cultures, it's seen as something that can make women more submissive and therefore reduce their chance of being raped. And that can go back to kind of this word fitna, which is an Arabic word, and I know Fatima Mernissi talks about it, kind of the idea that women in some cultures are seen as kind of inspiring male lust, and it's up to them to modify their behaviors. So FGM is kind of seems to be like another form of kind of women being expected to modify their body in order that they can prevent men from feeling sexual lust towards them. So it's kind of like putting the onus on women to modify their bodies and behaviors because of male behavior, which of course is very problematic. And other cultures, it's seen as kind of a rite of passage. So it obviously marks a woman's kind of, well, a girl's transition into womanhood. Other cultures see it as kind of an act of bravery, which is what Chiedozie was talking about. And in some cultures as well, it's seen as kind of something that is positive on marriage. It kind of like reaffirms marital bonds, and it's the idea that, you know, the woman won't really experience a lot of sexual desire, and therefore she's less likely to cheat. So there's lots of different kind of cultural reasons from kind of all over the globe as to why some people perform FGM. And your last question was about autopathology again, I think. And yeah, I would definitely describe it as a autopathological narrative, because it's not only kind of the FGM she talks about, HIV plays a huge role in the text as well. Because I wrote the paper mostly about FGM, I've not covered it that much. But yeah, a lot of the text is her as well, trying to come to terms with her status, with her HIV status, and try to kind of thinking kind of beyond that and not letting it define her. So yeah, her art is empowering both for her as kind of a woman living with HIV, but also as a woman who has undergone FGM. So yeah, it's kind of actually both are given precedence in the novel.
Thanks very much, Maria. I'm worried that we're running out of time, but maybe one last quick question. So Antonia says, thank you very much for two great papers. I was wondering if medical practitioners had responded in any way to these textual representations of FGM, and how have the writers themselves incorporated their activism into their writing?
I can give a super quick answer. Thank you for your great question, Antonia. Yes, medical practitioners have responded. Adele Barry actually goes around educating doctors about FGM and how they should treat women with FGM. And she kind of marries her activism and her writing, because, you know, FGM is part of her activism, but actually her activism is more broadly around women's empowerment and women's rights. So she set up Leaving Niger, which is about kind of empowering women through education. And she like regularly kind of talks to doctors, and she tries to go into schools and educate women. So yeah, she does loads, but yeah, she's kind of more interested more broadly in women's rights, and FGM kind of comes into that. The other short stories in the collection aren't about FGM. They're just about women in general and kind of their lives.
Thanks very much. Do you have an answer to that as well, Chiedozie?
No, I have not seen any like medical response to this text. Like I mentioned, it's published in Germany and it seems to be in the minority. It's not actually the kind of text everyone wants to read and teach in class. But there have been some kind of few publication here and there trying to reference the text, but it's not from a medical perspective. It's actually from as a way to to stand against this practice of FGM.
Thanks very much. Thanks so much to both of the speakers today. That was fantastic. Thanks to everyone as well that participated in the discussion at the end. We're going to have to end it there for today. But just to say that in 2 weeks' time, on the 1st of December, we'll be having a seminar on disability narratives, and that will have Hannah Thompson from Royal Holloway as a guest chair. And we'll be having papers by Sarah Simpson on intellectual disability and the undertones of eugenics in Amparo Davila's Oscar, from Katja Herges on affect, politics and gender in women's writing about ALS and dying, and from Christina Lee on beautiful Lyme, mindful crip aesthetics and the art of being sick. I should also say that me and Becky have been putting together a conference for next year that we wanted to follow on from this seminar series. So that will be happening in 2021. So we invite, well, we're going to be putting out more details about this by the end of this week or next week, but we invite abstracts from anyone that would be interested in that for next year. So yeah, we'll give you more information about that in due course. But yeah, thanks so much to you both again, and thanks to everyone for coming, and see you in 2 weeks.
Oh, just one thing before we leave, there is a fourth speaker on our disability theory kind of panel. She's called Alice Hill-Woods, and she'll be presenting autopathography as eco-biosocial resistance, Aurora Levins-Morales kindling. So yes, in 2 weeks' time, we've got a bit of like a big whopper for speakers. So yeah, please feel free to join. All the links are in the chat, as well as our email address if you want to get in touch. Okay, sorry, I just like railed you a little bit there, Ben, sorry. Okay, all right, thanks everyone. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.